Before all what's-his-name with a square mustache was the human embodiment of evil, there was at one time another. Veterans of the First and Second World Wars used to refer to the Germans they were having so many problems with as the Huns. The Huns were so well remembered 1,500 years later because of their exploits in the 5th century. And these exploits are mainly known because of one man, named Attila the Hun.
We, Draculs, have a right to be proud. What devil or witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood flows in these veins?
One veteran of the First World War was J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm going to propose a theory in this video that Middle-earth lore, especially the War of the Ring, was inspired by the 5th century crisis the East and West Roman empires suffered under Attila the Hun in the 5th century, who I think was the inspiration for Sauron. I didn't invent this theory, but I did stumble across it on my own, and I also have discovered much more evidence that no one has ever considered before. So even though I didn't invent the theory, it is extremely rare on the internet, with very few people discussing this at all. I first became interested in this theory about 10 years ago when I read Peter Heather's The Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1999. It describes the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in which King Theodoric was killed possibly by being crushed by his own horse. It sounds an awful lot like what happened to Theoden in Return of the King. So I went on the internet and I tried to find out if anybody else had noticed this, and I was actually disappointed, but one guy had written an article about it. Even if you do a search today, typing in Sauron and Attila, this article will appear at the top of the search results. And the name of the article is not even the same. It's called Tolkien and Attila. You can see also how rare this theory is. There's one guy asking if the Witch King of Angmar is based on Attila the Hun on Reddit. He had noticed the similarities between the names Theodoric and Theoden, as I did. And then there's an article here called The Roman Crisis That Inspired J.R.R. Tolkien, and that was written by me at Historium.com. They redesigned the website about a week after I put this article up, and all my images were lost. And it didn't look good. It didn't make the compelling argument I wanted it to with all the images that I thought would make it look real striking. So I just kind of abandoned this article on Historium.com, and now I'm making a video. I wrote this in 2018, but I've found a few new things since I wrote this article that I'm adding to the video. Here's the article Tolkien and Attila posted in 2012 on a WordPress site. The author, Matthew David Surridge, may be the father of the Tolkien Attila theory, which I name in honor of his fine essay. I'm just going to read off a few paragraphs of this essay. Now, so far as I know, Tolkien made few direct references to Attila in his writing. He refers in a letter to attending a lecture his son Christopher gave about Attila, and to being thrilled by a reference to the etymology of the name. From Atta, father, so meaning something like little father. And I understand in the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, Attila makes an appearance, as he did in the original poems on which Tolkien based his story. But I've begun to wonder if the idea of the Huns didn't have a bit more of an influence on Tolkien than that. Later in the essay, the author notes the similarities between Theoden and Theodoric, as I did, but one section takes it a step further and describes the similarities between the Visigoths of Theodoric and the Rohirrim of the fictional Theoden. It reads, Attila's stated reason for invading Gaul was to conquer the Visigoths, who had established a kingdom west of Roman territory. The Visigoths had come out of the east a little while before the Huns. They'd established themselves as on-again, off-again federati of the Romans, allies who were theoretically compelled to furnish troops at Rome's request. Essentially, the Visigoths were a client kingdom of Rome when it suited them, an enemy when the Visigoths saw more advantage in war. Attius had actually spent most of the decades before the Hun invasion fighting the fractious Visigoths. When Attila invaded Gaul, not only did Attius have to overcome his own dislike for his former enemies, he had to hope they would agree to answer his ambassador's call for them to come out of their homeland to join forces and fight Attila in Gaul. Now compare this with The Lord of the Rings, and specifically with Gondor and Rohan, an empire, the traditional source of culture and civilization, in decline. A younger and perhaps more vigorous culture comes out of the east and settles into an uneasy alliance just beyond their borders. Then, many years later, another, more terrible force also arrives from the east, a frightful horde. Only a desperate alliance of the old empire and the younger culture can stop them. That is, if the younger culture will respond to the old empire's need and leave their home to fight the coming darkness. As it happens, the Visigoths agreed, joined Attius and the Western Roman army, and their assembled forces met the Huns just before the walls of the city of Aurelianum, now known as Orleans. According to one version of what happened, the Huns arrived, saw the Allies garrisoned in the city, and turned back. Another version has the Huns arriving first and besieging the city. In this account, the siege went on, the plight of the inhabitants grew more and more desperate until, just as the Huns breached the walls of the city, the Allied armies were seen coming and the Huns were set to flight. But I'm not going to read this entire article, even though it's worth reading if you want to become interested in this theory. J.R.R. Tolkien never claimed that his stories were an allegory for anything, but Tolkien was inspired by history, and he suggested this many times in interviews.
You're obliged, any author I imagine, is obliged to call on his stock, private stock.
Is this another word for what Freud would call the unconscious?
No.
No, I didn't think it was. I
No,
want to make it clear.
both. What he is himself, both, no doubt, what he inherits, his unconscious, and what he has as part of his mental makeup and reading, his memory.
Now let's get into some of the things I've dug up. Rome is Gondor and Pannonia is Mordor. Even before the two world wars, the land of France has long had conflicts with Germanic peoples. Prussia conquered France in 1870, and they were rivals in the 7 Years' War, the conflict involving Frederick the Great. But it was during the Roman times, when France was the province of Gaul, when the Romans had to fiercely defend their border with Germania. This border with the barbarians was defended by garrison cities on a permanent basis. The garrison city of Trier stood for centuries guarding the Roman border with Germania. Its main gate was built in 170 AD, called the Porta Negra, translated from Latin as the Black Gates. There are more similarities between the fictional Black Gates of Mordor and the historical Porta Negra than just the names and the imposing size of these structures. In the Lord of the Rings wiki, a compendium not just on the books, but on Tolkien's lore, the following is written about the Black Gates of Mordor. The Black Gate was a mighty rampart built by Sauron the Dark Lord of Mordor in the Second Age to protect and guard the northern entrance into Mordor and to prevent invasion at the gap between the Ash Mountains and Efelduath. It was built with the power of the One Ring, like Barad-dûr. After Sauron's fall in the War of the Last Alliance, it was garrisoned by men of Gondor, who raised two great towers of the Teeth, Narchost and Carchost, which were built on either side of the wall and were tall enough to overlook it. This back and forth of the possessions of Gondor and Mordor is a common theme. Minas Morgul was originally built by men of Gondor and obviously was taken and corrupted by Mordor. It was even the launch point of the great attack on Gondor in Return of the King. This is mirrored by the history of the Roman Empire in Germania. The city of Trier and the Roman-built Black Gates are in Germany today as they were when Tolkien was serving in World War I. In the 5th century, Trier was conquered by Attila the Hun. Attila's lair was on the Great Hungarian Plain in what was once the Roman province of Pannonia, before the Huns took control. The natural geography of Mordor and Pannonia are very similar. This is even stranger when you consider that Sauron's attack was launched on Minas Tirith from Minas Morgul here, while Attila's attack was launched from the Great Hungarian Plain here, the center of his empire. And I do think it's implied in the writing of Tolkien that a large part of the forces that set out from Minas Morgul to attack Gondor actually originated from Mordor. The city was located in a vale where there was not a lot of space. Both invasion forces even marched to war along the path of a river. Attila's army marched west along the Danube, while Sauron's army also marched west along the Morgul Duin. Pelennor Fields and the Catalonian Plains. The Huns crossed the Volga in about 370 AD, driving many before them, causing many people such as the Goths to invade Roman territory simply to survive. The Romans were also terrified of the newcomers. Peter Heather implied that the Theodosian walls of Constantinople were built by the East Romans to beef up their fortifications in 413 AD because of the Huns. The Huns must have been the cause of a lot of fear and anxiety. We'll talk more about Constantinople later. While the Romans did battle with the Goths, the Huns established themselves on the Great Hungarian Plain near the Roman borders. In the 440s AD, the Roman wars with the Huns began in earnest. Attila became the ruler of the Hun Empire, and in 451 AD, Attila's famous attack on the West Roman Empire commenced. The Hun invasion has been blamed on Honoria, sister of the West Roman Emperor, who promised half the Western Empire to Attila and offered her hand in marriage. We can't tell if she was hot or not from this image from an old coin, but historians claim she looked like Penny from the Big Bang Theory. Well, not really. Before the Great Battle, the city of Aurelian was besieged by Attila. This is the current city of Orleans today. In an 1838 book, Attila, King of the Huns, written by the British botanist William Herbert, the war is told from a very religious Christian perspective. And Alan King Sangaban was in the city during the attack, but the city defenses were organized by Bishop Annianus, St. Agnan. While it might be a stretch to compare this St. Agnan to Gandalf giving directions to the defenders at Minas Tirith, The following account from Herbert's book is very striking in its similarity to that siege. The operations of the Hun were perhaps impeded for a few days by unseasonable weather, but his engines battered the town with irresistible force, and it seemed as if nothing but the direct interposition of Providence could save the town and its inhabitants from the terrible chastisement which Attila never failed to inflict upon those who presumed to defend themselves. Bishop Aenion prayed and prayed, but the walls were shaken by the force of the battering rams. The garrison inside were driven from the battlements by the Hunnish archery, and the battlements themselves crumbled under the repeated shocks of the blocks of stone that were hurled by the machines of the besiegers. He sent his attendant to look out and report whether he saw anything in the distance. The answer was no. Again he sent him, and nothing was distinguishable. A third time, and he reported like the messenger of Elijah that a little cloud was rising on the plain. The bishop shouted to the people that it was the aid of God, and throughout the whole town there was a cry of the aid of God mingled with the shrieks of women, for at that very instant the Huns were scaling the breach, and actually in the town, in a few moments, the city would have been a blazing and bloody example of barbarian vengeance. But Attila had seen the little cloud that was advancing in the distance, and recognized the dust that was raised by the rapid advance of the Gothic cavalry, which formed the van of the army of Aetius. Admittedly, this parallel is more striking when compared to the Peter Jackson films than the books written by Tolkien. In the Siege of the Books, most of the damage is to the gate of the city, or caused by arrows flying over the walls and starting fires. Still, the relief at the arrival of mounted allies in both the fictional and historical sieges is a fine parallel. Even more so when you recall that it is common knowledge that the Rohirrim are based on the historical Goths. Peter Jackson seems to have known this and depicts his warriors accordingly. After Attila retreated from Orleans, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains took place about 150 kilometers from the city later in the same month. An alternate name for the battle is Chalons. Another one is the Battle of the Catalonian Fields. As a pretty serious history buff, I can tell you that very few battles have the word fields in their name. To prove this in real time, I did a little experiment with the Google search engine and was very happy with the result. So in the experiment, I type in Battle of the Fields into the search results and I punch the button. And when the results turn up, the first result is the Battle of Pelennor Fields from the Return of the King. But if you go down only a few search results, you'll find the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, which proves that the word fields is very rarely used in the name of a battle in all of history. I've reread several times the Wikipedia on the showdown between Aetius and Attila, but had never read the Wikipedia on the Lord of the Rings battle. For that I always consulted the book itself or the Lord of the Rings wiki. When I finally did read the Battle of the Pelennor Fields Wikipedia, I found a wonderful Easter egg that I didn't have when I wrote my essay. The Easter egg is in the portion of the article called Concept and Curation. In the larger paragraph, the following is written. The scholar Elizabeth Solopova notes that Tolkien repeatedly referred to a historic account of the Battle of the Catalonian Fields by Jordanes, and analyzes the two battles' similarities. Both battles take place between civilizations of the East and West, and like Jordanes, Tolkien describes the battle as one of legendary fame that lasted several generations. And he goes on to talk about the similarities between King Theodoric and Theoden, which I've already discussed in this video. But both Theodoric and Theoden were carried off the battlefield by their knights who were singing and weeping while the battle still raged on. Another parallel between the historical and fictional battles is in the description of the Great Carnage. Tolkien in Return of the King describes, all were slain save those who fled to die or drown in the red foam of the river. Jordanes describes the Chalons battlefield. A brook flowing between the low banks through the plain was greatly increased by blood from the wounds of the slain. The Roman sources all seem to agree that the Catalonian Plains was the worst battle of all time. Peter Heather's ancient source Jordanes cites an awesome 165,000 as having died in the battle. Heather and modern historians reject this figure. Hydatius, a historian at the time of Attila's invasion, cites a ridiculous 300,000 as having died in the battle. The Wikipedia on the battle acknowledges the ancient sources, but historians today reject these numbers, which is understandable. What I don't understand is that the famous Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal defeated the Romans, and Arezzo in 105 BC are talked about as if they were greater battles than the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. I don't get this. I don't think I ever will understand it. Middle-earth is Europe, North Africa, and Arabia. At a glance, the lands around the Bay of Belfalas don't resemble those around the Mediterranean Sea, once ruled by the Roman Empire. But once you start to piece together details of Tolkien's lore and Roman history of the 5th century, it becomes difficult not to notice a striking similarity. My first step in doing this is to convince you that Minas Tirith is actually Constantinople. It's partially a composite of 3 cities. Orleans because that was the site of the siege discussed in the last chapter, and Ravenna because that was where the West Roman Emperor dwelled, and where he sent a letter requesting aid from the Visigoths, desperately asking for help to fight Attila. But Constantinople is the far greater parallel. For one, Tolkien is known to have described Minas Tirith as a Byzantine city. The peculiar walls of Constantinople are similar to the even more peculiar walls of the capital of Gondor. If indeed the walls of the East Roman capital were perfected as a response to the Huns, this is even more striking. In the next chapter, I will talk about the Huns being the inspiration for orcs. For the people of Middle-earth's west, the worst invading threats to the region approached near Minas Tirith, either from Mordor or from the south in the form of invading Haradrim. The Easterlings came west and the north, from the opposite direction. In the War of the Ring, the goal was to crush Gondor, making Minas Tirith a bulwark against all threats. This mimics the history of Constantinople fairly well. Over the centuries, many invading groups approached Europe from north of the Black Sea through Scythia, the Huns being one of these groups. Other invading groups like Arabs and Turks invaded from the southeast and had to cross the Hellespont. Vikings, sea raiders, even attacked Constantinople from the Black Sea via the Dnieper River. Constantinople, with its backdrop to the west of mountainous regions, was a problem for all these invading groups. This is very similar to the fictional capital of Gondor. It might seem to those versed in Tolkien lore that claiming Arabia or the Middle East are allegory for Harad doesn't hold water, as it was claimed by Tolkien himself that Harad was inspired by Ethiopia, and that the Haradrim were in fact black men. But I'm claiming that Minas Tirith is basically Constantinople, so the location of Harad is similar to Arabia. The Muslim religion and the Arabic language are common in East Africa today. Even the native language of Ethiopia, Amharic, not how it's pronounced, is a Semitic language that has roots in southern Arabia. The Zanj, black slaves from eastern Africa, rose up against their masters in modern Iraq in the 9th century. I'm not the first to have this idea of the Harad being Arabs, despite the word of Tolkien. Peter Jackson's Harad are Arabian in appearance. There's even a city in Saudi Arabia called Harad, but this is a modern industrial city, so I guess it doesn't mean anything. Middle-earth's Umbar region has a lot of similarities to North Africa during the same period as Attila the Hun. Umbar was once the greatest port of southern Gondor, but had broken with Gondor and eventually was ruled by the Corsairs of Umbar, who in time aligned themselves with Sauron during the War of the Ring. In history, Roman North Africa was invaded by the Vandals, who crossed from Spain, stole much of Roman North Africa, and eventually became sea raiders, conquering many Roman islands in the western Mediterranean. Also, King Geiserik of the Vandals is said to have been an ally of Attila the Hun, not just a thorn that happened to exist in Rome's side at the same time. Some of the finer details of Umbar in North African history at the time period are even more striking. Gondorian rebels called the Castamiri were supported by Umbar and caused the city to break from Gondor during the kin strife. They endured Gondor's revenge largely by allying and mixing with the Haradrim. The Castamiri were supporters of Castamir the Usurper. In West Roman history, a general named Castius supported John the Usurper, who briefly became emperor between 423 and 425 AD before he was executed. It even ties to the North African governor Boniface. Boniface never gave North African backing to John, but he did once support Castius in barbarian-ravaged Spain as he tried to restore order. Boniface married a Vandal, which might support the theory that he invited them to Africa. But when Geiserik rampaged across North Africa, Boniface fought to hold them back. It's not precise allegory, but we can see a picture of what was stirring Tolkien's imagination. When Gondor sent out its famous call for aid from Minas Tirith, it was done by lighting beacons and sending a signal over the White Mountains to Edoras, the capital of Rohan. In history, the Roman Emperor Valentinian sent a letter from Ravenna in a very similar direction westward, over the Alps to Toulouse, to the Visigoths, who had a reputation for fighting on horseback. They dwelled on Roman lands as a client kingdom, just as the Rohirrim lived on land that once belonged to Gondors, with their permission. What makes this similarity even more striking is one theory of the origin of the name Alps is that it comes from the Latin word albus, which means white. So that would mean like the Alps actually mean white mountains. And everybody knows that Tolkien was a fluent Latin speaker and an avid historian. On the Lord of the Rings wiki, the Anglo-Saxons are described as a primary inspiration for the Rohirrim. But in an alternate theory, the Ostrogoths are given as a secondary group that inspired them because of their reputation for using horses in battle. The Visigoths are basically the same people who traveled west. Ostrogoths means Eastern Goths, and Visigoths means Western Goths. The Rohirrim-Visigoth parallels, specifically, there's far too many of them for it to be a coincidence, more than any other issue. Attila is Sauron, and the Huns are orcs. When Emperor Valentinian sent his request for aid to the Visigothic king Theoderic, this was in the form of a letter. The 6th century historian Jordanes cites the actual contents of the letter as follows. Bravest of nations, it is the part of prudence for us to unite against the Lord of the earth who wishes to enslave the whole world. enslave the whole world, Lord of the earth. The latter happens to be one of the titles of the Dark Lord Sauron as well. It continues, who requires no just cause for battle, but it supposes whatever he does is right. He measures his ambition by his might. License satisfies his pride. Despising law and right, he shows himself an enemy to nature herself. Lord of the Rings is full of a lot of material about orcs destroying forests and having seemingly no respect for living things. Lands that Sauron ruled over seem to become wastelands. Ancient historians well document Attila the Hun's scorched earth tactics, even going so far as to destroy the potential food sources of enemies. And now the rest of that letter from the Roman Emperor to Theodoric. And thus he who clearly is the common foe of each deserves the hatred of all. Pray remember what you surely cannot forget, that the Huns do not overthrow nations by means of war, where there is an equal chance, but assail them by treachery, which is a greater cause for anxiety. Jordanes also cites the response of Theodoric to the Roman Emperor as well. Romans, you have attained your desire. You have made Attila our foe also. We will pursue him wherever he summons us, and though he is puffed up by his victories over diverse races, yet the Goths know how to fight this haughty foe. I call no war dangerous save one whose cause is weak, for he fears no ill on whom majesty has smiled. This historical narrative that Attila was a threat to all races and that all needed to stand together to stop him sounds a little familiar, does it not? The Romans regarded most of the people of their own Europe as barbarians, let alone an invading group that originated from thousands of miles away in Asia. It's well documented that the Romans considered the Huns to be monstrous in appearance, and for more reasons than them simply coming from another unfamiliar branch of humanity. The Hunnic culture itself altered the appearance of the Huns. The Greek-Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of the Huns soon after they first invaded Europe, but he died before Attila's ravages. The people called Huns, barely mentioned in ancient records, lived beyond the Sea of Azov on the border of the frozen ocean, and are a race savage beyond all parallel. At the very moment of birth, the cheeks of their infant children are deeply marked by an iron, in order that the hair, instead of growing at the proper season on their faces, may be hindered by the scars. Accordingly, the Huns grow up without beards and without any beauty. They all have closely knit and strong limbs and plump necks. They are of great size and low-legged, so that you might fancy them two-legged beasts, or the stout figures which are hewn out in a rude manner, with an axe on the posts at the end of bridges. They are certainly in the shape of men, however uncouth, and are so hardy that they neither require fire nor well-flavored food, but live on the roots of such herbs as they get in the fields, or on the half-raw flesh of any animal, which they merely warm rapidly by placing it between their own thighs and the backs of their own horses. So yeah, the Romans thought of the Huns as being pretty monstrous. Here's more from our friend Jordanes. Jordanes, 6th century Gothic historian. For by the terror of their features they inspired great fear in those whom perhaps they did not really surpass in war. They made their foes flee in horror because their swarthy aspect was fearful. And they had, if I might call it so, a sort of shapeless lump, not a head, with pinholes rather than eyes. There's an explanation for the deformed skulls Jordanes spoke of. It's well known that the Huns practiced skull binding their infants, causing a peculiar elongation of their skulls. This would make the Huns look even less human to the racially snobbish Romans, who already viewed barbarians as being beast-like. This practice is more well known as it was used by certain American Indian groups, but the Huns did it as well. Tolkien described his own orcs that he invented thusly. They are or were squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned with wide mouths and slant eyes, in fact degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. Tolkien had a great understanding of Roman history, and I believe the Romans' ill-favored perception of the Huns trickled into the writer's imagination, but he's not the only one. In a letter in 1960, Tolkien mentioned a 19th century fantasy writer that inspired his work. Tolkien wrote, "The dead marshes and the approaches to the Morannon owe something to northern France after the Battle of the Somme. They owe more to William Morris and to his Huns and Romans, as in the House of the Wolfings or the Roots of the Mountains." This is Tolkien writing. In the House of the Wolfings, 1889, a tribe of Goths live in an area called the Mark in a forest called Mirkwood, and rally together to fight Imperial Rome. These would be Western Goths, so here are the Visigoths once again. In its sequel, The Roots of the Mountains, also 1889, the descendants of the Wolfings from the first book are fighting the Duskmen, who are known to be allegory for the Hun. The second book has been compared with the story of the Dunedain protecting the peaceful Shire from orcs in Tolkien lore, according to the Wikipedia page on the volume. If we look at the history between Rome and the Visigoths fought Rome for many years before they finally joined forces to fight the Huns. Though Morris' second book depicts no massive battle with the help of Roman allies, The strange connection between Huns, Goths, and Tolkien is strangely there. Tolkien the man, a few curiosities, and summing it up. There was a very old church in the Cotswolds in England that was supposedly visited by Tolkien, and inspiring his doors of Durin that were the back door to Moria and the Fellowship of the Ring. St. Edward's Church is dated back to the Middle Ages, but the porch and trees in this picture are about 300 years old. This doesn't have a lot to do with the 5th century or Attila the Hun, but it gives you an idea of the sort of things that inspired Tolkien. If this could get his juices flowing, so could the Roman Black Gates of Trier, I think. Tolkien has also been associated with the 4th century cursed Roman ring that was found in Gloucestershire, England. Since Tolkien was a language expert, an archaeologist named Sir Mortimer Wheeler contacted Tolkien to inquire about the name Nodens on the ring. There is no proof that this inspired the One Ring, but speculation abounds, of course. I do find it interesting that the cursed ring was found in the Shire, a long ways from the center of the Roman world. Tolkien was known to have been very religious. I've heard stories that when the Catholic priests stopped using Latin in religious services, Tolkien himself would continue to use Latin. The spiritual aspects of Lord of the Rings and its connection to Tolkien's own religious beliefs are the last piece of the puzzle. Tolkien said himself that The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. You can read all about this sort of thing in the special Wikipedia page entitled Christianity in Middle-earth. Attila in his time was called the Scourge of God by Christians, and they looked upon his seemingly unstoppable rampages through a very religious lens. They believed they were being punished for their sins, and Attila supposedly liked the title of the Scourge of God and embraced the moniker to make himself more feared by his enemies. Most people who watch or read The Lord of the Rings can sense there were deeply spiritual aspects to the story, and according to Tolkien, this was connected to Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism. I asked Grok, the AI on X, would it be accurate to say that the war between Attila the Hun and the Romans was a war of pagans against Christians, or is this too much of a generalization? Grok, of course, took the side of the question being an oversimplification. It did, though, acknowledge that the Romans by that time were largely Christians, and Huns were pagans. I do know most Visigoths were Arian Christians. Arianism, this has nothing to do with blonde hair and blue eyes. It's a branch of early Christianity where they believed Jesus was a separate entity from God. Some of Attila's allies believed in this faith as well, I'm sure, but the Romans did see it as a spiritual war. This is what counts so far as being what inspired Tolkien in his seemingly spiritual battle in the books. According to Grok, from the Christian-Roman perspective, the invasions carried apocalyptic overtones. Contemporary writers and church figures interpreted the Huns as divine wrath for the sins of the faithful, and the impending end times. In short, the attacks were so terrible that the Romans looked at it as possibly being the end of the world.
What did you hear? Speak!
Nothing important. That is, I heard a good deal about a ring and a dark lord and something about the end of the world, but...
Stories of saints of the time repelling the Huns or a virgin's prayer saving Paris is also mentioned by Grok. This is just the sort of thing Tolkien would probably know about. This is the official end of my presentation of evidence of the truth of the Tolkien Attila theory. There are a few additional anecdotes that could possibly be coincidence, so I won't pretend that they should really carry any weight. Still, I think they are worth mentioning. In Minas Tirith, 3 days after the death of Boromir, Faramir spotted Boromir's funeral boat passing down the Anduin. Men of Gondor then found Boromir's great horn broken into and brought it to Denethor. This is how Denethor knew his son was dead. In history, the night that Attila died, the Eastern Emperor Marcian in Constantinople supposedly had a happy dream that Attila's bow broke in two. Attila, after being defeated at the Catalonian fields, built a pyre out of saddles, and was determined to burn himself alive if the army of Aetius came to take him. This is vaguely similar to what Denethor actually did in Return of the King. Lastly, the odd underground Roman basilica cistern that was built in Constantinople in the 6th century looks a lot like the dwarven city of Moria in Tolkien lore. It came in the 6th century, so it wasn't around yet in the time of Attila. As I said at the beginning of this video, I didn't create the Tolkien Attila theory, but hope I can say that I added a lot more evidence to prove its truthfulness. It doesn't take from other things that inspired Tolkien, like Scandinavian folklore, or the various languages like Finnish and Welsh that inspired his fictional languages. I think, though, that the evidence is too overwhelming to be coincidence. While few people know about this theory, a few people have already put together bits and pieces, enough to prove it's true. There's the scholar Elizabeth Solopova seeing the similarities between the real and fictional battles described in this video, but also knowing enough that Tolkien was interested in the battle that defeated Attila. The connections to William Morris, established by the words of Tolkien himself, that locks down that the orcs represented Huns, and the Visigoths existed as a people of Middle-earth. And then there's the original article that led me to be interested in this subject, where it is mentioned that the poems that inspired The Lord of the Rings had a brief appearance by Attila the Hun. All these things taken together, it becomes more than a theory. Well, thanks for watching.